Thank you. Can everybody hear me? Is this thing working? Excellent. Thanks for inviting me down to this. This is tremendously exciting. I left Lander shortly before this thing was created 7 or 8 years ago, and I've been really excited to hear about it through the airwaves and feel really deeply honored to be invited down to talk to you today. So thank you. I go all over the world now for this stuff, but for me, Lander is always home. So I wanted to pull on your coat today about a topic that has been on my mind for quite some time now, and I've been kind of exploring through the Wilderness Risk Management Conference and with a bunch of organizations across North America who found it interesting. And I want to do this as, rather than just lecturing at you, I want to build it around stories, because that's how this developed for me, the awareness of this issue through stories. And then I'll lecture anyway. So first story, before I started the job I was doing now, I was a program director for OB in its Rocky Mountain operation in Canada. And we're getting ready for a course to go in the field, spring course. Very excited. We run a fantastic program up there for First Nations youth. And we're getting ready for this whitewater canoeing course, and 2 days out, one of the instructors called me up and said, "I don't think I can do that course. I gotta drop it." And the staffing folks in the room are just going, "Oh, I know how that feels like. That's a bummer." But in this case, this is somebody I've been working with for years to build up to a certain level of skill. She was First Nations, female, and highly skilled whitewater paddler, of which, with that combination, there are about 3 in Canada. So I was pretty panicked and more than a little grumpy. But something in her voice just kind of gave me pause that there was something going on. So I asked her to come around, have a cup of tea, and talk about it a little more. And she said, "Look, I can't do it." And she said she'd been out with another organization a couple of weeks previous. They were on the Kootenay River in British Columbia, which is normally a nice, though challenging, Class 2-3 run. But the river happened to be in flood. And they had some student boats go over. The instructor boat was trying to rescue the student boats. The instructor boat wound up going over. Of course, in that part of the world, it's glacial-fed rivers. They're very cold. And the situation soon became really desperate. And luckily, everything panned out all right. Everybody got to shore, sorted themselves out, and on they went. But when she was contemplating going back in the field, she started to get panic attacks. She couldn't sleep. She was having a really hard time. So her boyfriend said, "Well, let's just get back on the horse. Let's get out paddling, and you'll feel better." So they did, and they went out and tried to paddle a nice, gentle, mellow whitewater run. And she was so tense that the boat would flip every time they tried to eddy turn, because her body just locked up and she literally couldn't paddle. So she and I talked through this a bunch, and we talked about her experience on this course that had the near miss. And we both came to the conclusion that she was absolutely right. She shouldn't go in the field right now. And I scrambled and found another instructor, and we made it work. But I've been talking to that woman for several years now through a healing journey, and it's really, when I heard that story, the penny dropped for me a little bit as a program director. And I just realized that was a story I'd been hearing over and over in the background over the years, and in fact participated in myself sometimes. And I just hadn't been really focusing on it. Excuse me. So she and I decided, in our conversations, we agreed that there's something going on there that just wasn't just with her. It was a fairly common thing, and it was potentially a blind spot in the industry. It was something we weren't seeing because we weren't looking for it. So she and I decided we would explore the idea of developing this as a presentation for the Wilderness Risk Management Conference, and see if there are other organizations out there who are feeling the same. So, so we came up with this concept of a very specific concept called near-miss trauma. And so when you have a significant near-miss event, which means, and there's a few parts of that. One, you have somebody who's in a position of responsibility over other people's lives. And responsibility implies control. If you're responsible, you're supposed to be in control of the situation. But as we know, sometimes the universe has other plans for you. So if you have a loss of control event, you're supposed to be in control, but you're not. And that could be for a number of different reasons. It could be environmental. It could be a really challenging evac. It could be a human factor event like you didn't think you were running a youth at risk course, but you get a couple of characters on the course who are enormously challenging, or maybe somebody with a significant mental concern. And you realize that there's fatality potential. You suddenly have that thought, wow, if I don't do everything right here as an instructor, somebody might die. And what we've learned, and at OB Canada we do a lot of work with military veterans. It's a fantastic program, and I've really learned a lot about trauma recovery from working with those folks. What we've learned is that the important thing is not the outcome of the event, but the process the person goes through. And that's where the blind spot comes in. When we have a significant incident in the industry, when we have a fatality or some other immensely troubling event, organizations usually react strongly. They do different things depending on the organization, but they always do something. And often, not always, but often, when there's a near miss, the response is either really muted or there isn't much of a response at all. But because it's like, well, everything turned out fine, right? Everybody was all right. So you're fine. And what we've learned is that's not necessarily true. So a little bit about the brain, not to get too technical, but the brain is an intensely complicated piece of work, obviously. And the best way I've heard it described is the brain didn't develop linearly, it didn't evolve piece by piece. In a linear fashion. It almost evolved like ice cream scoops, right? They're like scoops of development layered on top of each other. And the lower down scoops are the ones that were developed first in our evolution. That makes sense? They're the older ones. So a really simple way to look at it is lower down you have your reptilian brain, and then in the middle you have your mammalian brain, and on top is your human brain. There's areas between the reptilian and mammalian brain, specifically the amygdala and the limbic system, that have been in action for many hundreds of thousands of years to help us deal with our environmental things that were trying to eat us. And so when something really bad happens, and people are pretty familiar with this, that system goes into overdrive and releases adrenaline and all that good stuff. It decides on one of the 4 F's, which is our standard response to a very scary event. So fight, flight, freeze, or faint. Why they're all F's, I don't know, but they are. But there's other things happen when you have a big scary event. And one of the things has to do with memory. So you have something really scary happen. Let's say you're walking towards a tree line at dusk, and a cougar comes towards you and jumps on you. As you're getting full of adrenaline and you're fight or flight and all that stuff, your limbic system goes into overdrive and records everything. It'll record all the sights, sounds, smells, feelings, for use later, so that a couple of years later, assuming you survive, you're walking towards a tree line at dusk, and your limbic system, which has to do with patterns and memory, will trigger a response. It'll pick up on little micro cues. Maybe it's a smell, maybe it's a sound, maybe it's a certain way the wind is in the trees, and go, oh, last time those cues were present, something really bad happened, so I'm going to trigger a response. And evolutionarily been really good because it's helped us evade predators and whatnot. But in the modern world, that's a lot more complex. Doesn't always play out the way we'd like it to. Another thing about the limbic system, which lives kind of in the middle here, bottom middle, is that, and this is what Malcolm Gladwell goes over this, and it is well written but not super accurate book, Blink. But it's a good way to get started on this. The limbic system is essentially a fantastic pattern recognition machine. So when you're riding a bike, so you learn how to ride a bike, you don't have to think about it later, or you're not thinking you're thinking, you're going off patterns, right? And that works phenomenally well. But when your limbic system has been programmed, let's say, again, to return to the whitewater example, when your limbic system has been programmed on non-flooding rivers, and you're in a flooding river, so in terms of physics, the environment is working very differently from what you're used to, what you've been trained on. It throws your system in a haywire a little bit because the normal patterns are not working the way they're supposed to. So, for example, normally I think, okay, I'm on a big river, I've got my group, I'm going to get to an eddy, and things are going to be better. You know, we'll pull over and have a rest. You pull over to an eddy in a flooding river, it might actually make things worse. You've got boils, you've got whatever, and all of a sudden boats are flipping over in the eddy. Wait a minute, this used to be a safe spot. So you wind up in that place where, wait a minute, okay, I'm responsible, I'm supposed to be in control. Normally, my pattern system tells me to do certain things and they work, and now they're not working, and that's a very frightening place to be. All right, next story. So I've been doing this for a bunch of years, and I realized recently I hadn't actually told any of my own trauma stories. And I decided to give that a try this time. It's always a little risky talking about your own trauma in front of a big group of people. So if I break down crying or something, don't just roll with it. It's like an experiment in, existential presenting or something. So I was the course leader on a Knowles course in the Yukon several years ago. And again, another flooding river story. We'll do, for non-river people, we'll do different stories later, I promise. So we're on this river. It was in flood. It took us, and this can happen a lot on non-dam controlled rivers where you don't have water flow data. It took us quite a while to actually figure out the river was in flood. There weren't necessarily all that clear signs. But about 4 or 5 days into the course, we had an event where we were teaching and doing eddy turns and whatnot with the group, and a boat went over. No problem. We went to rescue it. Again, there was a big epic. We wound up in the water. We almost lost the boat. We had to chase it. A whole bunch of stuff. No big deal, really. We sorted ourselves out from that situation. But during that, we realized, oh, okay, this river's actually really charging. It's really in flood here. And we actually need to kind of adjust our approach to this course. So we did. But we started going down the river, but we soon realized we were actually in a really challenging situation. And when student boats would go over, it would become really desperate, and we were operating at or beyond our ability to keep things under control and rescue people. So we were about 20 days in that kind of situation. We were picking our way down the river very carefully, but we were definitely firing on all cylinders. My two co-instructors were very strong paddlers, hadn't worked with Knowles nearly as much as I had, kind of broke down a little bit emotionally and started to play the blame game and really focusing their blame towards Knowles. I can't believe Knowles put us in this situation where this is just dangerous. Somebody's going to get killed. And kind of emotionally losing it and venting within the earshot of the students, which was a little disturbing. So we had several epics but we worked through them very carefully. We got down the river fine, and everything was all right. As the course leader, though, and I thought I was fine, and yeah, where to go with that? It wasn't, I didn't really, I just thought I was a little tired. Boy, that was a scary course. Glad we got down fine. Everybody's safe, no problem. But 6 months later, I was working at quite easy, mellow river on the San Juan in Utah, and I had a student in my boat, and I just kept snapping and yelling at the student. I couldn't figure out why. Because I'm normally kind of pride myself in being a pretty calm, supportive person, but I was incredibly tense and snappy, and then I started to think about it and realize that I really hadn't been enjoying this course at all. I was really tense and having a pretty hard time, and I'd actually been considering whether I wanted to keep in the business. And I went and had a long talk with Abby Warner, who's kind of my supervisor at the time, and she was the one who pointed out to me, I think you might have some kind of trauma thing going on with that course last summer where you guys had a hard time. And that was the start of me kind of figuring out what was going on there. So signs and symptoms. When you have a trauma issue, things that you might see include, but are not limited to. So we see this a lot when people have near-miss trauma. They'll often, when time comes to, say, fill out their rap sheet for the next year, people get really tense and start to have challenges, and they don't always put it together what's going on. So you're feeling tense and unhappy, and you think, okay, well, I'm going to go do the things that make me happy. I'm a climber, I'm going to go for a climb. I'm a paddler, I'm going to go for a paddle. But if that was related to your traumatic incident, actually doing those activities might actually trigger you, and you might start to see those fight, flight, fear, or fight, flight, faint, or freeze things. And there's a whole rack of other symptoms that can come out. And so what I've started to find is that this is actually really common. There's a lot of this out there in the field right now, and a lot of it that's related to near-miss events. A little word on language. So again, this comes from my learnings working with veterans. So we encourage people to stay away from labeling people with things like PTSD. So post-traumatic stress disorder. That may be what's going on, it may be not. But when we're working with an instructor, for one thing, as lay people, we're not really qualified to make a clinical diagnosis of exactly what somebody has. But another thing, this is what we learned from the military, is that you really need to just work around the stigma of mental illness that is pretty prevalent in our culture. And PTSD ends with the word disorder, and telling somebody they have a disorder is a fairly heavy thing to use. The military, at least the Canadian military, I'm not sure if the US military is using the same term, but uses the term OSI, which stands for Operational Stress Injury. And the point there is to emphasize the fact that, look, these symptoms are clinically measurable medical symptoms. You're not going crazy. You have a medical condition going on. So it's an operational stress injury. You had an event at work and were hurt, just the same as if you tweaked your knee. Really kind of mellows out the situation. Next story. So this is a course on Denali several years ago. This whole report's on, I'll do it very briefly, this whole report's on Rendezvous if you want to read through it. So this is, Marco is the CL on this course. The course was at High Camp on the Muldrow Glacier route on Denali, and experienced a major storm event that lasted for about 5 days with winds gusting around 80 miles an hour. On one of the days, they had when they were at High Camp, there was a major wind event that went to probably about 130 miles an hour. and blew away a lot of the crucial gear, including tents, ropes, and the plastic outsides for people's boots, which are pretty crucial for attaching your crampons on. So the course was in a pretty desperate situation. Some incredibly hard work by the instructor team to keep everybody safe. They tried to dig in and dig snow caves, but things were so windy that that proved to be impractical. And they needed to do the best they could with their tents. And at one point, they were down to one tent for the whole group, with the knowledge that if they lost that tent due to the winds, they were in very desperate trouble indeed. Interestingly, Marco tells me that the initial thought was that major wind event was from the air blast from an avalanche that happened nearby, and that they've since decided that it actually might have been just a weather event, a microburst. Anyway, so eventually the winds subsided enough that they could start making their way down the mountain, picking their way carefully, with some students with some frostbite, and lacking a lot of the gear they would have ideally liked to have in that situation to get people down a glacier. You've got frostbitten students, not everybody's able to wear crampons, not all the ropes and stuff you want. They got everybody down safe. Fantastic job. There were some communications challenges. The team had called in from high camp on the sat phone and notified the base of the situation, but they weren't able to call back again for some time due to the intensity of the storm and the impracticality of taking your fingers out of your mitts to mess with electronics in that kind of situation. They weren't able to call for some days. This caused a lot of stress back at base, both for the base and the parks rescue people who were trying to figure out what was going on. And the team arrived back at base to encounter a little bit of tension and grumpiness initially from the base staff. And that's actually kind of a common thing that we'll talk about a little bit. So before we go, so again, some of the crucial factors here. You have a situation where you are put in a position of responsibility over other people's lives, and everything we tell people in our training and mentoring process is you're supposed to be in control of the situation. And sometimes that's not actually possible. One thing I've noted, and this is all somewhat anecdotal, this is stuff I've kind of figured out myself off patterns. I'd love to have somebody do a PhD on this and test all this stuff at some point. But one thing I've noticed is I haven't seen in the stories I've explored, and I've talked to people about dozens of these stories so far, haven't seen as much trauma with the students as the instructors. And I think because from the students' point of view, it's often like, wow, this is a wicked adventure. Or they're really bored because the instructors are taking all this time to go up and scout and figure out what's going on, and they're talking with each other, and they're really tense. And the students are just like, boring. Instructors, very different picture, because they're the ones with the responsibility. And the other piece is that one of the things I've started to notice is that the level of trauma can actually increase as you go up the instructor chain. The CL or lead instructor tends to get particularly hammered in these situations. And something to really watch for on both sides is something that can really enhance trauma after one of these events is blame. So you've had this complex situation, you're responsible, you're supposed to be in control, you weren't, and when you either self-blame or get blame from an external source, that can really intensify the trauma. So one of the things that's incredibly important in this is the social context and the culture within which we're working, and how we talk about these events, if we welcome talking about them at all, but talking about them in a supportive and encouraging manner that avoids blame. Doesn't mean you can't or shouldn't necessarily, give feedback or even have discipline if somebody made a really bad decision, but it's usually not a good idea to go there right away when people get back to town. And this has been a point I hadn't focused on really recently. Somebody pointed out last time I did this that, well, there's a blind spot within your blind spot, buddy, because you're not really looking at the in-town staff. And the Alaska example is a great example. So we're talking about responsibility and control. The in-town staff have escalated responsibility and way less control. Difficult as it can be to be in the field, dealing with a very challenging event, at least you can put your hands on it. You can make decisions, you can do things. The in-town staff is often looking at the phone, waiting for the phone to ring and find out if everybody's okay. And we need to start being a little more clever about how we manage trauma with our in-town staff also. One sec. So this is all very good, but so what? What do we do about it? So what I'd like to do is just kind of walk through actually how to handle one of these events a little bit, and I'll do that from both the field instructor and the in-town perspective. So you've had now, and the ideal, of course, is those two entities working together as a solid team, and one of the societal contexts that is really crucial here is whether or not the organization you're in has a strong culture of near-miss reporting. And I haven't worked at Knowles for a long time. I believe Knowles is actually very good in this regard. Most organizations can be better. But is it welcomed to go to your supervisor and say, hey, something happened out there, I really want to talk to you about it. What I coach organizations on is you're trying to make the transition from something scary happened, I sure hope the director doesn't find out, to something scary happened, I can't wait to talk this through with the director and get a little perspective here. And I've yet to find an organization that's perfect at the second one. Usually people, when they get scared, they want to hide stuff. And we want to try to stay away from that. So you have a scary event on the course. The natural thing, usually the symptoms we talked about usually don't pop up right away. Because when you're doing your course, you're in that drive mode of like, let's get everybody back to town safe. And then we're gonna put the tents away, and then we're gonna get our time off, etc. So you're kind of in that driving task mode, and you often feel fine because we're actually quite good at working through crises. And it's later that the symptoms pop up. So we need to give ourselves a little space to, just because I'm feeling fine now, just after it happened, I might not feel fine later. So one of the things we're trying to do is just bring in a common language to talk about this stuff. That's why we're bringing in terms like near-miss trauma, OSI. So for the team to just, hey, I think we just had a significant near-miss event here, and I think we really ought to talk about it and get a plan when we get back to town. Oftentimes what you see is either an evasiveness about the debrief, just not wanting to do the can we not do the debrief? We had a really good talk as an I team in the field, and can we just not do it? Or the classic wanting to stay at the surface level, and can we just talk about vans and brown sugar because that's safe. So committing in the instructor team, it's like, no, I think it's really important that we have a good talk about this in the debrief. And I'm going to tell a program super when we get back to town that this is going to be a key thing to talk about the debrief. That's a really important thing because you're taking control of the situation. I'm going to deal with this, but actually, and again, getting back control is a really important part of trauma recovery. Clearly communicating your needs. If whatever that is, but whatever you need to do to get to a safe, happy place to be able to talk about it. Maybe you need a little bit more time. Maybe you need the supervisor to bring you ice cream. Again, watching out for that externalizing which turns to blame, because that doesn't help in trauma recovery. So remembering that if we had a major event, the in-town staff might have their own stuff going on. And while there's going to be feedback on either sides, but taking refuge in blame is a false refuge, and it doesn't help. And it's always very crucial to clarify the facts. Interesting, I have a colleague who was a guide on a major avalanche fatality incident in BC a bunch of years ago, where 7 people were unfortunately killed. And he wrote a book about it, Buried, Ken Wiley. It's a great book if you get a chance to read it. Fantastic book. But he was calling the survivors over a number of years to just get the story together and figure out exactly what happened. And he couldn't even clarify the order in which they were skiing, because everybody who had been through the event had a completely different story about it. And that's really common. So it's really important that you just get the facts of the case. And if you're debriefing one of these events, you just got to be ready to shift course a little bit. So you might have thought you can talk about it, and you get in there, and one of the people just breaks down and is like, look, I just can't do this right now. Don't keep pushing. You might need to take a break. You might need to come back to it another time. But a very key thing is to start this process now in the debrief if you can. As we all know, and the program supervisors here will really relate to this, if you don't at least get a start on the process now, it's really hard to start doing it through email 6 months from now, because people scatter to the 4 winds. From the program supervisor perspective, you may be aware that there is a major near miss, you may not. Oftentimes you're going into the debrief assuming that it was a great course and everything was fine. That happens quite a bit. Maybe you didn't read the paperwork ahead of time. Or maybe it's not in the paperwork. So you may or may not know that there's something going on, and assuming that you don't, so a couple things to watch for. You're heading into the debrief and you just kind of sense that crackling tension in the room. Something big's going on here. Evasiveness. Oh, I don't want to. Yeah, there's a thing happened on day 10, but look, I don't want to talk about day 10. Actually, can we talk about brown sugar, please? There was not enough brown sugar. Again, trying to talk about the event and just not being able to. Tears in the room as you start a debrief. Again, anger. A lot of times people are really confused as to what happened, and that's where the blame comes from. And a lot of times people are just mad. Again, with that I-team I worked with in the Yukon, they were just furious. They felt like they'd been wrongly put into a position where people's lives are at danger. And it's a natural emotion. And a flag I've learned to watch for as a program supervisor is hearing a phrase, I've just never seen a river act like that before. I've been on the ocean for 10 years and I've never seen the ocean do that. That gets back to that limbic system in the brain, and it's like, and this is really confusing for somebody who's been an instructor 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, and you're used to certain patterns, and those patterns are no longer there. Interlude. I can't do this without talking about Patton, so bear with me. This, first time I did this, Liz Dewey pointed out to me that I spent 35 minutes talking about Patton, so we won't do that. Thank you, Liz. So now, this is a tangent, but it goes somewhere, so roll with me here. General George Patton, big general guy in the U.S. Army in World War II. Like many big general guys in World War II, he got his start in World War I. And in World War I, which was an incredibly stressful situation, no greater laboratory for studying human stress was ever created than World War I. And at the start of World War I, when people were showing the symptoms we talked about, they would shoot them. They thought it was cowardice, and they thought it would be infectious in the ranks, so they would, as a motivating example to the other soldiers, if you were showing signs of PTSD, they would shoot you. That's kind of a low baseline for effective therapy. That's where Patton got his start. By the end of World War I, they were starting to think a little differently, and they brought in terms like shell shock. They thought that maybe because of the concussions of these giant shells that were coming down, the body was getting mixed up somehow, and there was some sort of medical shock going on. They were wrong, but they were starting to ask the right questions, and they were starting to suspect that there was something medical going on. Anyway, back to Patton in World War II. So Patton took command of the American army in North Africa, which was very demoralized and not really getting anywhere, and he whipped it into shape. And they had some huge successes in North Africa. They led the charge in the invasion in Sicily and routed the Germans with the help of the British, or the British did it with the help of the Americans, depending on which book you read. And that was enormously successful. So here's a career officer at the top of his game, and they're getting ready for Sicily was a preparation for the full invasion of German-occupied Europe. Big deal. So here we have somebody at the absolute top of their game, a rock star, until the incident. Patton is touring a field hospital, and there's a young man sitting on a bed, white as a sheet, kind of shaking, goes over, "What's the matter with you, son?" He's, I just can't go back out there, sir. I can't do it. I can't go back out there. Patton's carrying a pair of leather gloves and slaps him. "Get a grip on yourself, son. You just don't be a coward. Get back out there." Naturally, the doctors are upset. They diffuse the situation. There's a couple of reporters there. And General Bradley, who was on the tour as well, pulls the reporters aside and is like, "Look, I'm not sure this is the story that the American public needs right now. Morale of the troops, home front and everything. How about you spike it?" The reporters say, fine. They spike it for a bunch of months. Patton does it again. And the word starts to get out, and the reporters are like, okay, we got to go live with this story. They write it up in the newspapers. The American public goes bananas. They're furious. Eisenhower fires Patton. So here we have top American general at the top of his game, the general that reportedly the Nazis feared the most on the Allies' side, and he's fired for slapping a soldier with an operational stress injury. This is how far the societal context had come in a generation. The American people whose fathers, brothers, sons had been through World War I and come back, people knew that there was something going on with them that had nothing to do with how brave or tough they were, and it had everything to do with a medical condition that we didn't understand very well yet. End of it. How to do this? Timing. Better? Good. Okay, last story, just to illustrate a bit of a different kind of incident. So this is an Outward Bound Canada course in the Rockies. Public enrollment course, not youth at risk at all, or so we thought. And we got two lads on the course who were on scholarship, kind of from Montreal, two twins actually. And it turns out they were extremely violent. They would react to any stress by one of them gets stressed, and they'd run across the camp and start beating up the other brother. 15-year-olds. And they're big lads. That's key in the story. And then soon as the instructors were not youth at risk instructors, just doing their best to kind of handle a situation, try to work with them, it just kept progressing and progressing. They're calling it in, talking to the in-town staff, getting coaching, but the in-town staff weren't totally grasping how big a deal this was for the instructors. And it culminated, the instructors finally said, heck with it, we're not calling the in-town staff anymore. They called me directly, got me out of bed, and said, look, we need you to do something. This is wrong. This is scary. And turns out there had been death threats. There was one of the brothers had a knife, and they basically had the rest of the students corralled at a different part of the campsite just to get them away from these two students who they really feared were going to hurt somebody badly. So I gathered some gentle but subtly big people, and we hiked in there and pulled these guys out. And those instructors experienced some fairly significant trauma from that course. All the symptoms we've already talked about, I won't rehash them, but it kind of illustrates that most of the events, the events I know that illustrate this are more environmental, but you can get it from behavior as well. So you can get it from, at-risk behavior, or you can get it from just a really challenging mental health concern coming out on course that you weren't expecting, that causes you to believe people's lives might be in danger. So, as I've toured and done this, just more and more people have come up to me with their own stories, and I've started to realize that this is just a really prevalent thing in our industry. And the good news is that, and I've stayed in touch with a lot of those people over the years, and just to learn what works for them and how they're doing. And the good news is that most of them are healing really well. So, crucial elements of the healing journey. I think the most important one is the intentional culture we decide to create in our organizations around trauma. Go back to the Patton example again of when Patton. Now, normally these days we probably wouldn't slap you in the face with a leather glove, but I have seen even recently in my own organization people reacting punitively when somebody tries to express that, hey, I think I have a work-related mental health issue going on here. It's like, well, that's not my deal, buddy. We need you to be out in the field on Thursday, so buck up. Get it together. If you can't do your job, we'll find somebody who can. And we need to be better than that. So we need to decide the cultural context with which we're going to view these events. And then it's okay to get help and to ask for help. And I broadly break help into two categories, the amateur and the professional, and both of them are very valuable. So you can go to a psychologist, a counselor, and get help. You can also get help from your friends, from your peers, family. A key phrase I've used when people are starting to process it, again, often there's just a lot of confusion. I don't understand what's going on for me. I used to be really good at climbing, and I can't climb anymore, or I get really stressed when I climb. I don't understand. Am I going crazy? That's a really common phrase. And I find that the healing journey starts if you can convince the person that no, actually this is a really normal thing. And the phrase I use is what's happening to you is the normal reaction to a really abnormal situation. When you can convince people that actually there are clinical, medical things going on with them and they're not going crazy, that helps. So things we can do as amateurs with our peers, or in our self-learning. Knowledge is key, so encouraging people to just research trauma and learn more about what's going on with them. Helping people process. Try to get people to move. When people are having a hard time, depression, anxiety, exercise really helps. Active listening as peers, being non-judgmental. Phrases like, oh, well, I've done a lot of mountaineering courses, and what I would have done are not necessarily that helpful. Giving that person that space that they were in a very abnormal situation, did the best they could. And being empathic, and something that's really challenging for us, practically, but is to just question whether that person should go right back into the field again. And if it was a very recent event, and they're having significant symptoms, I would offer that ideally they should not, and should come back at it after a little bit of rest. That's not always practically possible for us. One of the things we find in the literature is that people who are religious actually recover from trauma better than people who don't. And so if you're not a religious person, religion brings a lot of ritual and routine ritual to life that can be really helpful. And if you don't have that, you should try to replace that with something that works for you, because ritual is actually very helpful. Professional help is good too, and I'm told that Knowles has made changes to offer help with that, help connect you with a counselor, which is great. I really encourage that. Where this often fails is somebody goes to a counselor and has a really bad experience and just never tries counseling again. So really encourage you, if you are trying that and it's not working for you, just might not be a good connection with that person. So try a few different counselors until something works. EMDR counseling is something that is really gaining a lot of traction in the field. So this is eye motion desensitization. I always forget what the R is. Which is a specific kind of counseling that's recommended by the World Health Organization now. It's what they use when they're going into a refugee camp and dealing with just hundreds of people who are severely traumatized. And it's a specific kind of therapy that helps dissociate the memory of the event from the emotion of the event. So you can process through the memories without being overwhelmed by the emotion or getting triggered with other symptoms. And I've talked to quite a few people who've experienced significant avalanche near misses in BC who've said that if you can get EMDR within 78 hours of the event, you can often have significant results after only one counseling session. I know that's tough on a Knowles course, but that's where it is. Engaging your program supervisors in the staffing department and just having a conversation about where you're at in your healing and what it means for your career. Just the same as if you had a knee operation, you'd probably go into staffing and go, okay, I really want to keep being a hiking instructor. I had a knee operation, and how can we figure this out? Mental health is the same deal. And with your counselor medication, there are different medications that if you're being overwhelmed by symptoms can actually really help. They're generally discouraging these days looking to medication as a long-term fix, but it can sure help in the short term. So the good thing is that all these things work. We're set up pretty well to heal. It may take some time, it may take you years, but most people get better. So I'll just give you a moment to read through this. And this is kind of an important point from a culture point of view, from an ethical point of view, and from a legal point of view. So what I'm talking about here is specifically work-related trauma that's caused by a significant, highly impactful event at work. And the labor law is really scrambling to try to figure out how to work with mental health issues and trauma in the workplace. It's really challenging. The concern is that people will kind of play the trauma card to get out of work. And that could be, so that is, as we're building that culture, I think it's really important for us to be really self-disciplined about how we're approaching this, that we don't play the trauma card inappropriately. And that we just compartmentalize it. The near-miss trauma or fatality trauma is very different thing from cumulative stress or fatigue. You've just been working too many contracts and you're starting to get burned out. Those are different things, and we need to approach them very differently. Again, getting near the close here. The good news is that most people get better over time. You may or may not choose to keep doing the activity. You may drift into other things. But as human beings, we're wired to get better. And just because you have a traumatic event doesn't mean you're done. For most people, what it means is that we actually mature past it, and it helps make us better people. And mentally, it leaves a scar. It'll always be there for you. But if we have a supportive cultural context, we can be proud of our scars instead of ashamed of them. And that's a really important piece. So, where to go from here once we've got our culture down and we started dealing with these things a whole lot better? I think one of the next quantum leaps for us as an industry that we really need to make, and we're making some really good starts, is really looking at psychological literacy as a key leadership skill. The most common feedback from instructors in the last 10 years is we're seeing more and more mental health concerns in the field, and we need help. We need skills that we don't have right now. We're starting to figure out how to respond. I know, not WMI, Knowles Wilderness Medicine? Yes? Knowles Wilderness Medicine is adding mental health into the WIFR curriculum, and that's awesome. I'm not sure that's enough, though. One of the things we're looking at, and we're actually making a move in Outward Bound Canada to these acronyms. These are the Canadian versus the American acronyms. So in Canada, mental health first aid, and in Canada, and in the US, psychological first aid. So we're running a pilot project this year to start getting all our instructors certified in mental health first aid as a baseline competency. And the last piece I'll lead you with, this isn't ultimately just about us. Because one of the things we're seeing in the world is more and more major crazy events. And I think climate change is just going to accelerate that. As we start to see more big flood events, more big fires, and other just major events that simply cause a lot of trauma. And if we grow as an industry, we'll actually be positioned to provide a lot of leadership in that as our world tries to figure out how to cope with an increasingly uncertain and challenging world. And whether that, I have a friend who wants to put together a quick reaction force of outdoor leaders who have mental health training, who can actually, parachute into places like, say, Fort McMurray in Alberta, where the entire town was burned down a couple of years ago, and have the camping skills to actually survive in these locations and can actually bring help to those communities. So it's not all bad stuff. It's a growth piece that we actually have the potential to be leaders in the world with this stuff, and that's what we do. Thank you. Maybe one or two questions if there are any. We're almost out of time, but then I'm around the next few days, so any questions, please feel free to give me a shout.